So hi, my name's Kimberly Berman. I'm a special projects analyst for BMO. Started in September 2017, and even though I work in equity research, I don't cover stocks, I cover themes. And I started off the platform was launched with our EV work and battery chemistry. And since then, we've done some work in hydrogen, and I tried to learn about a new theme every year. I'm trying. And this year's theme is, basically the energy transition that's going to be happening in the United States, what needs to happen. And the central question is basically, why is it taking so long? So the U.S. has been lagging renewable capacity additions for some time. As you can see, Europe and China in particular have been growing quite a lot more rapidly. And and when you look at the energy storage capacity additions, you see that blue on the bottom. That you see that's basically energy storage, and that's ESS applications, and that's only happened because of Texas needs to. So that's basically where we're seeing this is the theme of the story, is that it's very, very slow. And if the state wants it, the state will get it. And that's basically the central theme that you need to remember. So one of the things that I found really, really difficult to comprehend is that the U.S. has really been a first mover with renewables. In response to the 1970s oil crisis, the federal government had enacted this law called PURPA, and it's a national law. And it's supposed to, encourage renewable and energy conservation. And so it was this first of a kind of its world. And so what exactly happened? Now, many years later, we're looking at an aging infrastructure. We're looking at, the American Society of Civil Engineers. It said that they have a C- rating for the energy infrastructure that is in the US. And so what gives? What's going on? So despite the benefits of energy transition, is not moving fast enough. And so again, it's about why. And as you can see with the US electricity generation by source, you see that coal is being retired at a pretty fast rate. So that's actually a good thing. And what has happened on the bottom chart, you see that although CO2 emissions have improved, we also see that NOx and sulfur dioxide emissions have also improved. And these are very important for air pollution and acid rain. And so we're seeing that there has been a cleaning up of the grid, but that coal has been mainly replaced by natural gas. And renewable non-hydro has only just slowly come onto the mark. So the grid is actually pretty clean already. So this chart here. I love this chart because, for one, these boundaries, okay, they don't change. And so this is the boundaries that are used by the North American Reliability Council. And that actually takes care of the reliability of the grid in the US as well as Canada. And you can see here that, I like to look at emissions from the grid. I like to use the eGolf because they have an ICE version and also an electric version. And you can see here that, basically driving an EV, that means emissions from the grid when charging. This is actually pretty good for pretty much all of the US, except for the MRO region up here. The reason why these boundaries are useful because they never change. And so that's why scientists always use these types of boundaries to analyze their data. But the real story is actually more complicated. So coal plants are being closed at an accelerated pace since 2016, and this downward trend is expected to continue. Coal consumption is its lowest in 40 years. It keeps getting lower. And closures, basically every other day, there seems to be another small plant that's being closed down and being replaced with renewables. So this is actually starting to accelerate just now because the costs have come down. So when we're looking at why coal in the US is such a target, is that the US coal plants are much older. So 88% were built between 1950 and 1990. And the average age is about 45 years. In comparison, China's oldest operational plant was built in 2006 and onwards. So basically, the coal plants in China are less polluting. There's just a lot of them. And why that is a problem is that, as you see on the chart below, you really need to have an ultra supercritical coal plant in order to have, to burn cleaner coal. So it's actually, and it actually is more efficient, and it's 14% less coal input for the same kilowatt capacity. So, okay, so now we're closing down coal plants in North America. That's great. We're replacing it with nat gas. We're replacing it with renewables. We're seeing that this is a big issue. And I'm asked a lot about why they use CO2 as the benchmark. So decarbonizing transport and energy sectors will also mitigate the global air pollution problem. And this is a huge problem in the US, especially around urban centers. So how urban centers were designed were that back in the post-war period, they had a housing boom. People were coming back from the war, and the federal government had given the states as much money as they wanted to build highways. And so the cities actually started to build highways in the middle of the city. So that's basically, it's very, very different than with other countries. So that's why you had everybody move out into the suburbs. So you have these cities that are chopped up with these highways, and it's been shown that people who are living along these highways have higher incidences of cancer, higher incidences of respiratory illnesses, and people that typically live around these highways don't have the capacity or the means, the financial means to get the treatments that they require. So what does that mean? And that's a big social impact on American way of life. So what are the carbon air pollutants that are present in fossil fuel-based transportation and energy generation? And I just wanted to point really quickly to particulate matter. It's probably not something that most people have heard of. And basically, particulate matter is just anything. So the exhaust from the tailpipe, let's say, mixes with the surrounding emissions from a plant, and they stick together. And they call it particulate matter. And scientists take it away from size. They basically separate them by size. So a particulate matter that are about 10 up to 10 microns. This is you breathe in. There's exhaust. It's sand. You can easily cough it out. When you have particulate matter of 2.5 and lower, you basically this basically goes deep into the lungs, and it stays there. So then it reacts. This is why air pollution causes these very rare cancers. And one of the best things about the pollution problem in China is that we're actually having these microcosms of data that we can actually show that, this is actually direct cause of air pollution. And there's, these crazy cancers, like especially with never smokers, that are like they have been smoked like 3 packs a day just because they're near a highly polluted plant. And this is what it is. It's particulate matter. So particulate matter is now the main identifying basically for air health. So that's what the American Lung Association uses. This is what they're using it for. So coal plants are notoriously bad for particulate matter. They're notoriously bad for sulfur. And so why is sulfur dioxide a huge problem? So this is actually from my undergrad, this map. I found it. So this basically shows how acid rain. So this is basically, if you look at the map before, you see where there's a lot of coal plants in that area. And you can see that the sulfur dioxide has caused a lot of acidification of the Great Lakes. And so why is that a problem? So what happens is that the natural ecosystem changes. So back in the 1960s, 1970s, a Canadian scientist was able to show, basically dump a lot of phosphorus and sulfur into a pristine lake, and showed how the pH levels, as it went down, how certain species started to die off and started to congregate, and then algae started to grow on top because the sunlight doesn't get down, So that's what they call eutrophication. And so because Lake Erie was a very, very shallow lake, it was considered dead. It was considered dead because it was just all full of this algae. And they actually do have green algae problems still once in a while, but they know how to fix it. And that's why you don't have phosphorus in your detergents anymore. This is why, there was such an attack on coal just in the early 80s. It's because of this acid rain issue. And as you can see, this is improving with legislation, with national legislation. So when we talk about CO2, I just wanted to drive the point home that we're not only talking about CO2, we're also talking about particulate matter. We're also talking about sulfur dioxide. We're talking about nitrogen oxide. These are all elements that interfere with the balance in the atmosphere. So investors, as you know, are much more environmentally conscious and are incorporating ESG in their decision-making process. We heard today from a fund sustainability fund, and she was telling us their own criteria of ESG and how they quantitatively assess companies based on ESG. I can tell you that every company basically has their own metrics. And so it's something that if you are wanting to have an ESG focus and want to get into these sustainability funds, it's really important to understand how they're coming up with their criteria. They decide what they care about the most and they rank them. And it depends on basically policies as well as the internal policies, as well as what they think is sustainable and what should be the priority. So they have their own set of priorities. And so for me, when I look at ESG for the energy sector, it's basically, I see it as reducing coal dependency in the US, is seeing environmental improvements and such as what I talked about. There's more to be done. And the digitization and climate change problem. So what I mean by digitization, especially, is that, we have like 5 or 6 devices now, right? That have to be powered. That has to, that comes from emissions from the grid. That's charging from emissions from the grid, as well as air conditioning. And so what I wanted to just say is that climate change is basically making certain states hotter that need more air conditioning. And so that means that all the energy grids that are built in the US are based on summer peak capacity. So they believe that at least they can they can have enough to generate for that peak, and then they're okay. So that peak capacity in the summer is getting higher and higher and higher because of air conditioning. So so basically we have an aging infrastructure here. We have to increase generation capacity because of climate change. And that's just one example of the climate change that's impacting the US. And another thing is we talk about societal. So employees in traditional energy sector, we're going to face redundancies. And we're already seeing this in Germany with the auto sector, right? So all the traditional auto sector labor they're actually protesting because of just changes into their job and what their job is. There's no more jobs and they have to get reskilled and all of that stuff. And we actually saw a couple of examples in the US with GM plants being retooled. So it's a careful balancing act. And Texas, for example, is luring talent from Silicon Valley because they just don't have it. So that's sort of one of those things that, when you talk about creating jobs, you're actually creating jobs that are going to be requiring skilled labor, and that labor is going to be hard to come by. And governance, obviously, they're going to have to start evaluating their environmental externalities, and that's going to include analysis and communicating those financial risk profiles. What I mean by externalities is just basically pollution and cleanup. Usually, that's sort of the main externality that impacts the mining sector. So back to the US grid. This looks pretty simple enough. It's split into 3. There's obviously the Eastern interconnection is the biggest, and it's the most problematic, as well as the one that's the most aging. And in the West, that's relatively new in comparison. And it's actually at the Northwest, it's actually a lot of hydroelectric power. So that's actually a really good area to get cheap electricity. Tennessee and Virginia also has federal hydroelectric power plants, and Virginia has one of the largest pump storage facility in the world. And as you can see, ERCOT, that's Texas, they keep, the reason why they keep, it's, as you can see, it's right within the state borders, is because they don't have to answer to the federal government. So this looks pretty easy. And so when I started this, I thought, it'll take me a couple of days to learn this. It's no big deal. It looks pretty easy. So then comes in the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC. So before I showed you a map that had delineation that doesn't change, and that's NERC. So this is where all the acronyms come in. NERC is basically a, I think I have the map here. That's the NERC. So that rarely changes. And this is the FERC. All right, that's the FERC. So as you can see here, you got CAISO, ERCOT, SPP, MISO, PGM, NYSO, ISO, New York. So New England. So these are actually areas that are deregulated, substantially deregulated. Certain counties are deregulated, and they run a wholesale market. So in the Southeast, Southwest, Northwest, they are regulated. They're regulated states. And basically that means that, that this is the price that you're going to get for your energy, and that's it. So state regulators decide that. That's it. And basically there's a line, and all of the utilities have to manage their assets, and they cannot basically have these price spikes, or they'll be held to pay. They'll have to go in front of Congress to explain why they didn't have the means to keep their electricity prices within that guideline. So that's Southeast, Southwest, Northwest. All the rest are basically done by a wholesale market. So that means that there's an actual, it's like almost like a stock market. It's a financial market, and it's basically based on supply and demand. So that's NERC. So everybody talks about the NERC borders, the FERC borders. And so what does this ultimately mean? So the state regulators basically decide what energy mix and how electricity is bought and sold. Like I explained before, in this area here, just to drive the point home, these are wholesale markets where you basically, it's like a transaction. So a generating unit will have, okay, well, we have this much electricity, and this is how much it's going to be paid for. And if there's a shortness of supply, then the prices go up. And in New England, these states have the highest prices in the US. Just because of the wholesale market and supply and demand. And they also have, I mean, it's a really hard question to answer. It's like everybody said that it was because they have renewable portfolio standards, but when I did the data analysis, it's not true. It's actually based on basically that they're deregulated. So if they're deregulated, that means that their electricity is bought and sold on a wholesale market. So these are all basically, and some of those states in the middle are regulated, but they actually participate in the wholesale market. So it's insane. And so you can see that, these dashed lines here, that's where the two markets intersect. And so that, like in North Dakota, for example, they will be the SPP and the MISO, Regional Utility Board. So they actually have the state regulations and then two boards that are basically, and whether they align or not, who knows? Like they say they try to align, but they rarely do. So this is my map, and each state also has put in place a renewable portfolio standard, an RPS. Now, PURPA is a national policy, but each state can decide what will be a qualifying asset and whether that there will be some dominance in the priority when they're trying to reach that peak power. So they often have coal plants to handle that peak power, but it's very, very difficult to turn on and off. And so renewables are actually quite agile. So the green states here are ones that have renewable portfolio standards above and beyond the national PRPA regulation. The blue states have something, but they're not exactly as stringent. It's sort of involuntary. Oh well, if you have a good project, maybe we'll give you the policy, maybe we'll allow that to happen, type of thing. And the purple are actually, these are states that never even talk about renewables at all, but they're actually putting in a lot of wind because it's cheap and it has a low footprint. So this is basically the map this is the most important map for renewables. If you go back to this one, you can see the gray areas. So that would be really great for sun, like North Carolina and South Carolina. These are regulated states. They have a little bit more control. And they're looking at, obviously, renewables, just because from a cost perspective and because of the environment. And so that's great. And then in Oregon and Washington, they have a high amount of federally funding hydro, so hydroelectric power. So this is what it is. So every state has their own energy mix. Some are regulated, and so you basically have to go to the state in order to allow yourself to do business in that state, and regulates the utilities. And then you also have the ISOs and the RTO regions, which is basically has the wholesale market. So this is the complication that's happening. This is exactly why the energy transition hasn't happened as quickly as it should, considering that we have the resources here, we have the talent here, and it's like, why? So this is a very, very important slide. Just like I said, it's just because, I wanted just to point out California. And so why California comes under fire is that they were one of the first states to really go big in renewables. And one of the differences between California and, let's say, New York State, who also has lots of hydro and also has sort of a renewable type of mandate, is that they actually prioritize renewables before anything else. And so basically, when they have to deliver electricity to reach that summer peak, they go through all of their renewables before they go into their natural gas and all of that stuff. So that's actually a very, very interesting state to look at. However, they are partially deregulated. So what I mean by partially deregulated is that in the South, they started to deregulate, and then the electricity prices went high, and all of a sudden everybody was angry, and they said, okay, well, we have to re-regulate the state. And so there was only 3, including PG&E, who is deregulated, and so then they own the transmission lines, and that's why we have some of the oldest transmission lines in the South, and so it's actually like everything comes down to these policies, the state policy and state mistakes. And we're always paying for the sins of the policy mistakes of the past. So what does that mean for commodities is that, number one, wind is happening. Wind is happening faster, just for the simple reason that it's easy, it's low cost, and it has a small land footprint. So for firms and things like that, it's definitely an ideal solution, especially in the Tornado Alley there. And so that means that it's good for copper and for offshore wind. If they can actually get the state to be on board with offshore wind, then that'll be good for rare earths, because the permanent magnets that are used in offshore wind, and it's actually better for copper too, because you have to use copper wiring instead of aluminum when you're in the ocean. Just because of the oxidation of aluminum. So transmission wires are actually aluminum because of the weight, and that's something that has to be modernized as well. So that's going to be good for aluminum. The problem with aluminum, and why we talk about why aluminum versus copper all the time is just because copper doesn't oxidize, whereas aluminum does, and it has to be treated. And so what happens as well is that when an electric current goes through, it expands and contracts. And so the connections, like the screws that are at the connections, they actually loosen if they're not done properly. So aluminum, and then they'll actually coat some aluminum wires with copper, and they'll actually make copper right at the end, so that expansion and contraction, so that it doesn't spark. Basically, it's just for safety reasons. This is another thing, is that putting those wires underground is very expensive as well. It should happen, especially in California. It should absolutely happen. It's not going to, because it's just too expensive. So it's good for copper, good for aluminum, good for rare earths, and good for the battery metals. And so this is lithium iron phosphate. It's actually used already in EVs, especially in China. And this is actually an interesting commodity, because it's such a the reason why it didn't take off in the Western world outside of China is basically because of a patent issue. It was invented in the University of Texas. It was raised by Hydro-Quebec. And so they had quite an extensive patent issue, but it was managed by this company out in Switzerland, and it was just very complicated. And so the patent situation for NMC, which is nickel, manganese, cobalt, which is used mostly in most non-Tesla EVs, basically was at the forefront, right? So a lot of the know-how and a lot of the information that we have is on NMC versus LFP, and LFP is now actually coming off patent next year. So we're seeing already companies are shifting towards LFP. The reason why LFP is such a good thing is that it's cheap. It can be made with lithium carbonate. It's just iron, and that could be recycled and made into battery grade iron. And for ESS applications, that's the golden. It doesn't really matter about size. It doesn't mobility and batteries in laptops, it matters about size. It doesn't matter with ESS applications. And so you have to watch what's going on with this, because this is going to be very interesting. That said, there was an article by Jeff Dan. He's the Tesla research chair, and he actually had created a prototype for a 4 million mile battery, which is going to last about 100 years. And so that actually does have nickel, cobalt, and manganese. So that's not going away. Even though I'm excited about LFP, the NMC is not going away. So we've got energy transition metals. We've got iron. We've got iron. We've got nickel. We've got manganese. We've got cobalt, lithium. We have aluminum, copper, rare earths already. And then now we also have PGMs. So if hydrogen, what's really important about this slide is that hydrogen, it's great. It can be paired with, just similar to battery storage, it can be paired and it can be a storage device, and it can actually produce fuel. It can actually, store energy when you need it. And it could be turned into a circular economy. Like, you could actually use waste in order to produce hydrogen. And so Air Products, for example, is brilliantly building a facility in Louisiana where they're going to be able to turn all the waste from Texas, from all the oil and gas industry, to turn waste into hydrogen for their own purposes. And so they're actually thinking, this is how these companies are thinking now. They're thinking of controlling their supply chains, bringing it close, and being able to not have to deal with any of the tariffs and the export, import, supply chain issues and everything like that. This is how they're looking at things, and they're also thinking about that circular economy. And so why is it important to you guys to know about hydrogen? It's basically because of PGMs, platinum in particular is required. And this is why. This is because the catalyst to split water, it's actually pretty hard to split water. It's not easy at all. And these are the catalysts at the top of the triangle that are okay. And palladium just doesn't work in this environment. So it doesn't work in the environment, in the acidity of the membrane that's in between for a PEM electrolyzer. So an electrolyzer and fuel cell is the same thing. It's in reversed. And so a lot of the fuel cell technology that happened in the 1990s, basically the US DOE and some large labs in the US basically studied the reversal of fuel cells. And so they're actually named the same way. So they need the same type of metals. And so PGMs are used in fuel cells as well as electrolysis. So these are all the commodities that are going to be impacted by the energy transition. And I'm sure that we're going to discover a lot more. So, yeah.
Do we have any questions for Kimberly? Alice, yeah, 1 second.
I knew you were going to ask a question.
Can I give you this so the cameras pick it up?
You know, I've been, since I was a kid here in New York many years ago, the process of splitting water into hydrogen has just fascinated me. And can you not tie a hydro like up in the St. Lawrence Seaway or up in Montreal, tie that into splitting water?
Absolutely. It's happening.
Just like it's happening now?
It's happening now.
Isn't it the cheapest way of doing it?
It is the cheapest way of doing it.
And what about hydrogen fuels like,
Quebec.
Sorry?
Quebec.
It's the best.
Quebec is doing that right now.
Quebec is doing that.
Yeah. And just trying to work out the kinks.
And what about all these hydrogen fuels? Well, the hydrogen fuels that exist out in Arizona, for instance, pure hydrogen.
Right.
And it's stored in the ground already. I mean, so that's got to be pretty inexpensive too.
That is.
And as a bank, how are you involved in the process other than beautifully explaining it? Like, how does that affect you as a bank?
So I work in research and I work with covering analysts. And so I had the privilege or not privilege, depending on your perspective, of shadowing our utilities analyst at the American Gas Association. And so then I basically go and I've been invited to give this talk to boards and things like that. And so it's just about relationship. My job, my main role is to relationship build. And then I'll say, okay, well, this is a person you should talk to, and just to showcase our knowledge.
So is BMO investing in ESG directly?
Yes, through our we're banking. Do you know anything about Bank of Montreal's in Toronto? Yeah, it's a 200 bank. Anyway, we have asset managers, but they're actually clients. So we're on the capital market side, we're on the sell side, and then we call them BGAM.
Thank you.
Global Asset Management, and we do have a sustainable fund as well. We have a sustainable financing team as well. That just came into fruition like about a year ago.
This is a sizable fund, I would imagine, right?
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good to know. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Okay. Any further questions? No? All right. Thanks, Kimberly.
Okay, thanks.